by the Center for Human Rights Research. My name is Adele Perry. I am a settler, a mother, a feminist, and a historian, and I'm also the current director of the Center for Human Rights Research. Our work is rooted in the territories of the Anishinaabe, Innu, and Métis people, governed by the promises, most of them unfulfilled, of Treaty 1 and also of the Manitoba Act. The CHRR's mandate is to bring together people and research around human rights broadly defined. And one of the important threads in the work that we have done over the last decade has concerned reproductive and bodily rights. What it has meant to do this work has changed in the last 3 weeks when the US Supreme Court officially overturned Roe v. Wade, declaring that the constitutional right to abortion no longer exists. This was not a surprise, but it was and is shocking, and a prompt for us to remember that the struggle for control over our bodies remains. Reproductive rights and justice rests on the ability to choose the number and spacing of one's children, the right not to have children, and the right to have them and to keep them. We know that many of the ways people who can get pregnant in these territories cannot access these rights or access them easily enough. There is the coerced sterilization of Indigenous women, something that attorney Alyssa Lombard is working to address in a class action lawsuit brought by more than 100 women. There is lack of access to abortion care, especially in the north and in rural areas. There is ongoing systemic racism in healthcare. Other rights are coming into the crosshairs of courts and governments, including those of the LGBTQ Two-Spirit Plus community and Indigenous nations south of the Medicine Line, whose powers were diminished by the same court that struck down Roe a mere 5 days later. It is all connected and none of it comes to a full stop at the border. Our panel today is our first effort to address these questions within the particular context of Treaty 1. We have 5 remarkable and very accomplished speakers with expertise in research, practice, and advocacy. I'm going to introduce them all in order, and each speaker will offer us about 5 minutes of reflection. The panel will then have time to ask each other questions, and then we'll have a remaining 10 minutes or so where we can take questions from everybody who has been kind and gracious and committed enough to join us on this call. So our first speaker will be Dr. Sarah Elvins, and she is a professor of American history and also the associate head of the Department of History at the University of Manitoba. Second, we will hear from Kemlin Nembhard, who has over 3 decades of experience working on social justice, human rights, and community development. In 2020, she became the executive director of the Women's Health Collective in Winnipeg. We have Dr. Lindsay Larios, who is an assistant professor in social work and interdisciplinary critical policy researcher here at the University of Manitoba. She studies citizenship and immigration as it intersects with family and reproductive politics and policies. Our next speaker after that will be Karen Sharma. She is a first generation South Asian living in Treaty 1 territory. She's the acting executive director of the Manitoba Human Rights Commission. She is also co-organizer of Queer People of Color Winnipeg, an organization that creates programming that centers and celebrates Two-Spirit, queer, and trans, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And she also chairs the board of director at the Women's Health Clinic. Our next speaker will be Nahani Fontaine. She is the member of the Legislative Assembly for St. John's and a longstanding advocate for Indigenous women and reproductive justice. And finally, we will have thanks from Dr. Shana Plout, who is a scholar and an activist and a journalist, and also the acting manager of the Center for Human Rights Research, waving there. We are grateful to be joined by everyone who has made time to come with us at this important moment to consider these questions, including a member of Legislative Assembly, Uzoma Asakwara, who I note is on the call. And welcome to Uzoma and to everyone else. And with that, I will turn things over to our first speaker, Dr. Sarah Elvins.
Great, thank you very much, Adele. I'm really pleased to be, well, I'm not pleased because we have to be here, but I felt very honored to be asked to be part of this panel. Like so many of us on the panel today, I was absolutely dismayed by the Dobbs ruling and the implications for reproductive health for women, for people not only in the US, but in Canada as well. And so today I thought I'd talk a little bit about the history of abortion and travel across the Canada-US border. So I'm actually a historian of the United States, and I've done work on sort of cross-border travel and sort of cross-border culture. It's always been the case that geography matters when it comes to access to abortion. Even after the passage of Roe versus Wade, the reality was that in some areas were much better served than others in terms of access to reproductive care, birth control, sex education, prenatal care, counseling, and pregnancy termination have been more easily accessed in urban centers than in rural areas, in red states rather than blue, in the northern US rather than the South. Women traveling to procure abortions is nothing new. Before the 1973 ruling, Roe ruling, state-to-state travel existed, as did highly organized transnational networks to guide women across borders. Canadian and American women of means flew to Europe in the 1950s and 1960s. American women also traveled south to Tijuana, Mexico. By the late 1960s, American women from the Northeast came to Montreal to go to the Morgentaler Clinic there. After Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau reformed the Canadian Criminal Code in 1969, in theory, women across Canada had access to abortion. But I'd say it's really important for us to recognize that this was only in very specific circumstances. Women had to get a referral from a doctor to a local hospital, and then be approved by a panel to determine if the mother's physical or mental health would be at risk. So this was not automatic. This was not necessarily an easy process. So in 1970, when the state of New York decriminalized abortion, women in Canada were very aware that this was an easier place to access safe legal care. In 1970 alone, New York State provided abortions to over 1,600 Canadian women, and that number would go up to 6,000 the following year. In an age before the internet, women arranged abortions by relying on information provided by friends and acquaintances, by university or college health services, and by abortion referral agencies. An advice column in Chatelaine magazine in 1972, for example, counseled that New York State would accept Canadians unquestioningly and advocated for Canadian women to go to New York if they needed this care. Agencies in Montreal, in Ottawa, and Toronto arranged travel to New York, so going so far as to arrange flights or sometimes buses to have women go to specific clinics. And new clinics even emerged close to the border to serve Canadian women. So in Plattsburgh, New York, for example, a new clinic was founded specifically to capitalize on demand for abortion services from Montreal. I would say that if history has taught us anything, it's that making abortion illegal does not eliminate abortion. Curbing access simply moves people to seek abortion elsewhere, sometimes across international borders. And of course, this option is most available to those of means, to those from the middle or upper class. So, that's a whole separate question about how this is going to affect people who do not have the ability to travel and the means to travel. We can now think of increased challenges in crossing the border and the costs involved. Today, for example, women crossing the border need a passport, something that was not required in the early 1970s. So that's yet another hurdle that is going to be a challenge. And with the Dobbs ruling, we face the probability that the resources for women to access care in Canada will become even more burdened as people from the United States come north. So I think this idea that throwing this to local state jurisdiction will just mean, oh, women can travel easily. That will not be an easy process for many, many people. So the events in the United States have real consequences, I would argue, for people across North America. And we need to be aware of this and be vigilant about this and not take for granted or be too smug in thinking that this won't affect people here in Canada as well. Okay, thanks very much. And I'm going to turn things over to Kemlin.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And thank you so much for having me and for organizing this really important discussion. Because I think, we really need to keep talking about this as well as organizing about it. And, what's happening, and I really think what's happening in the States right now should be a wake-up call to us all, particularly here in Canada. That border, it may, it has a much greater impact than we often think. And I think apart from the potential impact of people coming to Canada seeking care, which, I just want to say here at Women's Health Clinic, we will continue to provide to people no matter what their circumstance, no matter where they're coming from. We cannot underestimate the impact that decisions like these and like the hateful rhetoric that comes along with it can have and will have on our political discourse here in Canada. So, as an example, within hours of the decision being announced in the US, an anti abortion rally was announced to take place the next day at the legislative buildings here in Canada. Like that, like within, I think, 3 or 4 hours. That, I think, demonstrates exactly what, the other impacts that can happen when decisions like this are made in the US. And I think it's really, again, I keep saying this every interview I've done, and prior to this even, right, is that we can never, never, never take for granted all the hard-fought rights that we enjoy here in Canada. And specifically when we're talking about in relation to abortion care, that, while I like to believe, I like to think that a decision like that is less likely to be overturned here in Canada, there are other ways that they can try and limit, access to abortion care. And I think you touched on some of these things, Sarah, but like specifically here in Canada at the moment, our fight is in relation to quality of access because access to safe and quality abortion care is not equal. So firstly, if you look at where abortion care services are provided predominantly, they're provided predominantly in large urban areas. So if you are located particularly in northern and rural communities, you have to travel great distances to access abortion care. And that in effect limits access. We're talking about travel expenses, expenses for, staying somewhere, expenses for losing days at work, looking at childcare, like all sorts of different things, which and those particularly will have an impact on people who are the most marginalized, often people of color, indigenous people, people who are poor, and many people who are already, um, you know, uh, affected and marginalized from the healthcare system and many systems already. This is going to have, an even larger impact on them. And I think secondly, one of the other challenges here is specifically around limits to providers that are trained to provide this care. So that's also something that we don't really talk about a lot, is the fact that this care is not taught in medical schools, which is absolutely horrendous. That generally speaking, sexual and reproductive sexual and reproductive health is not taught in medical schools, specifically if you're not cisgender male. Everything is based on cisgender males. And so what that means is when it comes to care like this, is there are very few providers that are actually trained to provide this care. And most of those providers are, again, located in large urban areas. The other issue with that is that even if you have a provider in your town, in a small community, given already the sort of crazy stigmatization around accessing abortion care, that means that many people are not comfortable talking to their healthcare providers about trying to get access to that care. So even if your healthcare provider may provide that care and you don't know, people don't necessarily feel safe or comfortable asking their healthcare providers about getting that care. And quite frankly, all people who have uteruses should feel safe to request this care and should have access to this care, no matter what their circumstances are or where they're located. And those are, I think, two of the big fights that we need to actually never lose sight of here in Canada and also really organize around. So, yeah, before I finish, I think I just want to say, most importantly, we can never take our foot off the gas. We need to keep talking about why this care is important, what it means if we don't have access to this care. So I think some of the things that Sarah already talked about, just, talking about just the fact that making it illegal doesn't mean that people won't access this care. It means that they will often be put in situations where they have to make really awful decisions that could very well have, permanent impacts, not on like on their health, which may even result in death, right? And so we can never lose sight of that. And we need to make sure that we are all talking to our politicians about this. We need to talk to all of our MLAs, we need to talk to our MPs and MPPs, because it's through our silence that our basic rights, no matter what they are, become threatened and then can be taken away. And so again, we need to use this as a wake-up call, not only like with this specifically, but not only with this, with anything that has to do with reproductive care and reproductive justice. I will pass the baton on now.
Thank you very much. Next up is Lindsay Larios.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone who was able to attend today and for this opportunity to come together to speak about these important issues. I think my reflections here build really nicely on what Sarah and Kemlin have already shared. So I'm happy to continue that conversation. My research focuses on the intersection of immigration and reproduction. And I've been thinking a lot about the work that borders do, who they're meant to keep out, what it means to be able to cross them, and the ways in which they impact access to basic services and resources like healthcare, sometimes in a protective way, but also almost always exclusionary. And like other folks on this panel, I've been asked many times about whether we should be concerned about Americans coming into Canada to access abortion care, especially given the current challenges our healthcare system is going through. And while I understand and see the real practical importance of this question, it also makes me wary. This is a line of questioning that borders create. If abortion care is healthcare and healthcare is a human right, there should be no question. And in fact, like Sarah was saying, Canadians and Americans alike, along with anyone who has the privilege of this kind of global mobility, have often crossed borders to access healthcare. And it makes me wary also because this line of questioning aligns very much with the long tradition we have of scapegoating people who cross borders for the inefficiencies and lack of resources in our healthcare systems. We need to be wary of the use of borders to divide us into groups of those who deserve care and ones that don't, splits the feminist fight for reproductive rights from fights against border imperialism and migrant justice, from fights against racialized neoliberal capitalism, and forces us to feel protective of our own rights and view those facing injustice as a threat rather than providing support as allies. So on this note, I just want to talk a little bit about the kinds of challenges that folks in communities I work with and do research with face when trying to access abortion care or healthcare more broadly, because they cross borders to get here. So although abortion care is decriminalized in Canada, many migrants face unique barriers to many forms of reproductive and sexual healthcare access because of their immigration and citizenship status that really need to be considered in ongoing reproductive justice activism and policymaking. For migrant workers, many who work in rural areas in agriculture or food processing sectors, often living on site with their employers at farms or in the homes of employers that they work for, experience a lot of geographic and social isolation. So we have workers with very limited support networks and familiarity with the healthcare system, who rely a lot on employers for transportation, who registering them for necessary health documents, and on assistance for navigating the health system. And there's also a lot of stigma around migrant workers having intimate relationships. They're frequently told by their own governments or by their employers to abstain from sexual relationships, to not get pregnant. And so workers themselves feel like there's a real risk to lose their job and not be hired back the following year if they're seen to be problematic employees. As such, they often do not wish to disclose their pregnancies to their employers, but frequently have no choice because they need them for transportation and to help navigate these systems. Another major barrier is cost. So while many migrants have access to public health insurance, not all of them do. And in those cases, healthcare costs are paid out of pocket. So depending on the stage of the pregnancy, the type of abortion care needed, and the province where someone is seeking care, paying for abortion care out of pocket can cost between $500 and $2,300, plus any additional costs for travel and accommodation. This is even more problematic if the pregnancy is at the 23-22 week mark, when care becomes very specialized. And so it's not uncommon for pregnant people in Canada to have to travel to the US to receive these services. But for folks with precarious immigration status, this may require obtaining a travel visa, additional costs, wait times, additional bureaucracies and stress to navigate those. And if they don't have the right documents to travel to the US, it's very difficult to get care. Despite these barriers, we have stories of migrant workers, international students who feel that when they do get pregnant, abortion is their only real option here, given the extreme costs and vulnerabilities associated with being pregnant and raising a child as someone with precarious immigration status. So again, related to costs or concerns about employer immigration repercussions. So it's important to think about, alongside abortion care accessibility, there's a real dire need to ensure accessibility for prenatal and obstetric care for all people living in our communities, to ensure that they can make the decisions they need with dignity, self-determination, and support. And I'll leave it at there. Thanks.
Pass things over to Karen Sharma.
Thanks very much. This has just been so fascinating to hear sort of each of our research or practical experience with these issues. So along that vein, I suppose I'd like to start just by stating unequivocally, as is supported by international human rights law, that reproductive rights are human rights, including the right to access abortion. Restricting abortion access jeopardizes a number of fundamental human rights, including the rights to life, because we know that restricting access to abortion does not have the effect of eliminating abortion. All it does is eliminates access to and creates an increased prevalence of unsafe abortions, which places pregnant people's lives at risk. In addition, we know that human rights treaty bodies have, established well over the years that restrictions on abortion access amount to cruel and inhumane treatment and punishment, represent impermissible barriers to the right to health of women and pregnant people, and really jeopardize a sort of woven together framework of rights, including the right to equality, the right to civic, political, and social and economic rights, et cetera. So this is fundamentally a human rights issue. I think there's no doubt, and we've really covered that ground, that the experience of what's happening in the US right now presents a serious fundamental threat to these human rights. But we also need to be honest about the fact that we continue in our own territories to fail to live up to the promise and obligations that these fundamental human rights have within our own communities. You've heard some of those ways that abortion access continues to be jeopardized within Manitoba and broadly Canada, whether that's just in sort of the unequal access to medical and surgical abortion across our communities, whether those are geographic barriers, et cetera. I think the experience with Miso medical abortion access is a really good illustration of just how challenging it can be to get even access to what we know is supported, evidence-based medical care. It took years between when Mifegymiso was recognized and when it became universally accessible in Manitoba. And even still, we have healthcare providers, including family physicians, et cetera, that continue to be reluctant to prescribe Mifegymiso, even though they are well able to. And Kemlin's noted some of the ways in which gaps in training, et cetera, continue to perpetuate those barriers in getting access to medical abortion care. Dr. Larios has noted the many ways in which legal status presents barriers in access to reproductive health care, whether it's international students, individuals who are on visitor or work permits. Access to care becomes costly. There are so many barriers just in terms of being able to enter healthcare systems, et cetera. And generally, Kemlin, you've noted the geographic barriers that are just present within our communities, whether if you're outside of Winnipeg, getting access to surgical care becomes really precarious. But I think we also just have to recognize that access to these rights is occurring within a broader system that presents so many barriers and inequality for individuals, including BIPOC folks, people with disabilities, poor people, et cetera, who've experienced significant discrimination and harm within our healthcare system. So their ability to enjoy and access reproductive rights, has long been sort of challenged by history of forced sterilization within these systems, the stigma that's surrounded just generally the reproductive choices of BIPOC individuals in particular. So we have to be really honest about the fact that access to abortion care continues to be compromised within our territory. And what's happening in the US shows us, just as you noted, Kemlin, that ensuring these fundamental human rights requires ongoing, sustained, and loud action. We need to, over the coming months, years, et cetera, intensify our efforts to ensure access to these rights. We've got to take up the calls for mutual aid and care across and against borders, as you've noted, Dr. Larios. I think some of the strategies that Dr. Elvins noted, like supporting each other's travel and access, forming networks, are all things we really need to mobilize over the coming time. I've seen, on social media calls for abortion showers. I think we should be doing that. Let's, maybe in addition to or forget about baby showers, but let's start supporting each other's abortion showers so that we can help each other get the funds that we need to be able to access care. And I've really been, thinking about a couple of weeks back, the Women's Health Clinic held our AGM, and we had the Arkansas Abortion Support Fund organizers come out and talk to us at our AGM, and they just spoke really passionately about the fact that, it's important not to become complacent and not to think that these rights are given. And what's happening in the US has really demonstrated that. So let's, continue to stay vigilant and stay loud about our need to be able to access these fundamental rights. I'll pass it over.
Do you want me to go, Adele? Okay.
Yes, absolutely. Passing it over to Nahani.
Okay. Anine, everyone. First off, miigwech for organizing this really important and timely panel. I think it's always important to continue these discussions, and obviously, particularly in the last couple of weeks. I'm going to keep my 5-minute comments to something that Kemlin mentioned in respect of, the role that politicians play. And I think that, I've been, since I got elected in 2016, I've been very vocal in respect of standing up for abortion rights and abortion access. And Chili Dog is starting to cry just as I'm starting to do my speech here. You know, when we talk about abortion access in Canada, you know, one of the things that we can do immediately is elect the right people. It is actually rather simple in many respects to elect the people that are truly committed and willing to do the work to ensure that citizens, all citizens, regardless of where they reside, have access to abortion. And that those individuals that provide abortion are protected. And so, you know, who we elect matters. And, you know, why does that matter? Well, if you look at conservative MPs right now, I think it's like 75% of their caucus are anti-choice. In the last, since I think it was like 2006, I can't remember how many bills, motions, and policies that they've brought forward to the, you know, to Parliament for debate in respect of restricting access, restricting abortion. And I always say to people, because again, I think 100% we take for granted that we have access to abortion. And again, under, you know, not everybody has access to abortion. I think about communities in the north and rural areas, we do not have access to abortion. And so I think that there's this kind of, we take it for granted. We think that Canada is so great in respect of abortion access. In fact, every single time I post something on Twitter, typically it's men and typically it's white men, like, shut up, do your job. You don't know what you're talking about. This is only in the US. No, like there are barriers here. And so when we look at these MPs who have gone out of their way to produce private members' bills, which is a lot of work. People don't realize the amount of work that goes into constructing and establishing and introducing a private members' bill, has done all of this. Given the chance, in a heartbeat, these same politicians would do whatever was in their power to restrict abortion access. And that is a fact. They would do that. And so, you know, here in Manitoba, we've got several conservative PC MLAs who are anti-choice, who go to rallies, who speak at rallies. Since I believe in 2007, and this fall might be my 6th time, I think I've done it 5 times. I've introduced the abortion protest buffer zone. And all that bill does is it establishes a buffer zone for anti-choice Manitobans who feel that it is their right to stand in front of hospitals, stand in front of different, you know, agencies that are offer abortion services with their, like, you know, molesting, you know, propagandic signs, and think it's their right to do that and harass everybody that's going into these facilities. And all it does is set up a buffer zone 100 feet away. Go protest somewhere else. You're still allowed to protest, just not right in front where people are trying to access services. Every single time that bill has fallen, every single time. And just recently, a couple of months ago, the first woman premier of Manitoba stood up in the House and voted against that bill. Who you elect matters. It matters. This same government a couple of years ago gave almost $17,000 to the Pembina Pregnancy Crisis Center. These centers actively tried to discourage citizens from accessing abortion, right? And so you're giving $16,000, I think it was for their infrastructure or capital project or whatever it was, at the same time that this government is starving women's resource centers, starving them. And so, you know, I you know, when Kemlin says, you know, reach out to your MPs, reach out to your MLAs, yes, 1000%. There should be active campaigns to encourage, you know, MPs and MLAs to support legislation that protects rights, that protects access to abortion, and at the bare minimum, vote these people out. Vote these people out that would put you know, those that offer abortion services at risk, and those accessing abortion services at risk. Vote these people out, because at the end of the day, even though they're elected to represent everybody, they don't care. They don't care, and they will do whatever they can to restrict abortion access. I think I've gone over my 5 minutes, and so I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Nahani, and thank you to Sarah Elvins, Kemlin Nembhard, Lindsay Larios, Karen Sharma, Nahani Fontaine for, I think, a really remarkable and incredibly time efficient. Everybody stayed within the ambit of their 5 minutes. But real sort of introduction, and also a call to action and to solidarity and to vigilance that I think is important here. So what we're going to do now is open up the kind of the floor to the panelists to ask questions and make comments to each other, because we have a wide range of sort of expertise and knowledge here. So I will just ask if anybody has a question or a comment that you would like to put here. We've got a comment, Nahani, somebody's comments in the chat, 100%, thank you. So thank you very much for that. And do we have anybody would like to raise a question for their other panelists? You can just,
if I can.
absolutely. Adele. Take it away.
And I guess you know, this came to my attention, I guess, just this last week. The Canadian Medical Protective Association. I don't know if anybody knows about them, but I guess they offer, you know, legal advocacy to doctors and etc. They released something last week that I thought was really interesting that I actually had never thought about, right? And one of the things that they did, they wrote a letter to Justin Trudeau asking for the federal government to ensure that there's more protection for doctors or abortion service providers, because we do know that states, right, are going to sue doctors that give abortions, are going to try and restrict folks from leaving the state to access abortions. So I thought that was really interesting that, you know, here was this organization looking to the federal government to establish liability protections. And so I'm curious for Kemlin and the women's, you know, have you thought about that? Has there been any of that discussion?
Absolutely. I mean, it's definitely a concern, especially when that letter came out, became more of a concern. Right now, we're a member of NAF, which is the National National Abortion Federation, Canada, as well as the US. So it's a international, and there's different branches of it, and they're actually looking into that a little bit as well to see if there can be, through them, if there can be a broader protections for providers. Now, having said that, I think generally speaking, you know, that's not going to stop us from providing abortions, but I think it is important to keep in mind, you know, that also impacts that accessibility of abortions. So when we look at in Manitoba, and I think generally across the country, there are more and more providers that take training to be able to provide medication abortion, because it's a short training. And since the decision in the States that you can take it through NAF, in fact, as well as a few other places, but that training, several more people have signed up to take that training, which is great. One of the challenges, though, is that if you live in a smaller community, the reality is that abortion providers are still under threat from different, you know, people in their community. And so they often do not publicize that they provide that care. Something like this also increases that, I think, that threat for people, right? So that they're not going to be publicizing that they provide that care, as well as potentially meaning they may stop providing that care. You know, if you are one doctor in a small community that provides that care, what are the chances, you don't even have the broader community support that you would have from, let's say, a group of providers, let's say in Winnipeg, right? And that anonymity even. So it's definitely a concern for us, but nationally we're looking at that through NAF. Yeah, so I think that's probably all I can think of off the top of my head in terms of that, but it's an ongoing issue.
Great, thank you very much. I just want to note a couple of questions that we'll get to the questions from the question area in just a second, but I'll move things now just to Shayna Plout has a question, and then Karen Sharma, and then we will move on to the ones in the question section.
Karen, if your question or comment was following up on this, please go ahead.
It was. Maybe I'll comment before we move on. That I think that this is a very legitimate and real threat to physicians practicing in this area that we need to take seriously. From what has been sort of publicized of the experience in the US post the Dobbs decision, you have a lot of providers who, before providing care, are needing to do like consults with their lawyers and get legal opinions around the liabilities they might incur, particularly in the case of providing like emergent or sort of life-saving abortion care. So I think we need real political leadership on this particular issue to ensure that there are liability protections for providers. We've needed that for a long time, right? But I think that what is happening in the States is only intensifying that need for clear liability protection. So I know that we'll be talking about what do we do in the next year, and I think that should be one top kind of priority item, is ensuring that providers have greater protection. I mean, they need protection around protest and the work that you've been doing, Nahani, but we also need to ensure that we mitigate those legal risks as well.
Can I just say one thing? Sorry, I'm just going to take 1 second. I just want folks to know that in respect of those liability protections, is that I am scheduling a meeting with our legal counsel to start looking at whether or not there's something legislatively here in Manitoba for abortion providers. So I know that letter had gone to Justin, but in my mind, I'm pursuing to see if there's something provincially. So I just wanted folks to know that.
Thank you very much for that. Shayna, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you everybody for coming together, and by everybody I mean, the guests as well as folks who are attending. This was a time of personal, I know, anger and disillusionment, and I'm glad we can turn it into something constructive. As somebody who grew up in the States, as well as somebody who emigrated here to Canada 12 years ago, one of the things that I know, and I grew up in a state where abortion was very much protected, but then I also went to university in a state where it wasn't. So California and Ohio are kind of the opposites. Abortion is not enshrined in law. The right to abortion is not enshrined in law in the US, nor, as I understand it, is it enshrined in law in Canada. And I'm wondering, what are the obstacles to actually having it enshrined in law? Because once it's enshrined in law, then there are operations that can make sure that it's actually enforced and there's accountability for it. So why has that not happened? And here I'm looking at the historian, as well as what needs to have that happen so that there is equal access once it's codified in terms of practice. And here I'm looking at, practitioners and scholars as well.
Just as a quick point, in terms of the difference in Canada versus the United States, I would say there's also a danger in enshrining it in law, in that laws can be overturned and people can have court challenges. And so the one good thing in Canada about it not being enshrined in law is to say, this is healthcare. This is not, we do not need a separate law about this. We do not want to make it up to lawmakers about what kinds of things come under the jurisdiction of the law, that this should be something between someone, a woman or a person who is considering their options in pregnancy and their healthcare provider, and that this is not something that you necessarily want to have codified, because then you could have all kinds of immediate court challenges, different cases to test the law. So in some ways, decriminalizing, but simply leaving this under the provision of like, this is healthcare is safer in some ways. And I immediately thought about this too, that I totally can understand this, that you need to have this stipulated in terms of protecting people that are providers of this type of care. But I also immediately thought, oh, but could there be a way that this could backfire? And so that to me seems, just seeing how this Dobbs ruling has played out makes me a little bit nervous about saying, oh, we need an abortion law in Canada. Personally, I don't think we do. I think that there are other ways in which changing the discussion and making everyone aware of the importance of abortion access for healthcare, not simply sort of walling this off from other kinds of treatment, that is what needs to happen to change the kind of discussion about it.
So I want to thank that both the question and that answer, which I think goes a very long way to explaining that also the particular history of the struggle for reproductive justice in general and abortion care in particular in the Canadian context, which I think has ended up landing in that particular space. And I'll just note that both Karen Busby, former director of the Center for Human Rights Research, founding director, says she completely agrees with Sarah in her comments in the chat there. So I think that is a remarkable kind of way of coming at it. And I just noticed that Kemlin, do you want to speak to that as well?
I mean, I can't speak to it as well as Sarah did, but I think the other thing is if we look at the way ours is protected, it's through the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And again, I think that is actually the strongest way of protecting it, right? And if people, go and look at what the judgment was, right? I think that in itself, for me, provides, they'd have to walk back so far, right, in terms of personhood, right? That, like, which is why I feel fairly strong that I don't think something like that could happen in Canada, simply because, like I said, that it's more, the threat we have is more around access, right, in terms of how you limit it that way, as opposed to as opposed to the right to it, and the fact that it's healthcare, right? So
excellent. Yeah, Karen.
That's exactly right. I was just going to add the bit about Supreme Court decisions that have upheld that restrictions on abortion access violate our charter rights. But also, I think just to build upon Dr. Elvins' comments, that we don't medicalize or we don't politicize other kinds of medical procedures, right? And so, creating a separate law around abortion access does that. And it says that there's something distinct about abortion, that we should treat it not as other forms of healthcare. And I think we should be careful about doing that, because that really is rooted in patriarchy and in kind of a desire to control the bodies of pregnant people.
Thank you very much. So I just want to move over to our next sort of stage in this powerhouse of 1 hour of reproductive rights and justice and research and thinking and action. And we have a question in the question section from Uzoma Asagwara. But Uzoma, I'm wondering if you want to just ask your question. You should be able to do so within the powers of Zoom.
Can everybody hear me?
We can hear you. Yeah, loud and clear.
Sorry, I panicked. I wasn't sure how to do that for a second. Okay. My question was just, and thank you to all the panelists. You folks are just, your expertise and commitment on this issue is just incredible. And it's been an inspiring almost 1 hour to listen to you folks. My question was regarding, in terms of enhancing abortion access and rights here in Manitoba, more broadly across Canada. Over the next 1 year, what would you identify as the absolute top priorities in terms of what advocacy should look like, can look like, or areas of focus should be?
So excellent question there from Uzoma. What are the priorities from this point onwards? And I'll begin with Nahani.
Oh, well, I know that for myself personally, I don't know if people, I'd imagine everybody on the panel would know this, that for the most part, Manitoba, and it doesn't matter what government, has never had a provincial, comprehensive, robust, reproductive provincial strategy. And so, which includes everything, right? We saw this government get rid of lactation consultants and close down the Mature Woman Center, all of these things, right? We've never had something that was comprehensive for the province, so that citizens know what is available, where we can access, identifying those gaps. So I know that for myself, that's one of the things as we, again, as strictly as a politician right now, as we prepare for the next election and for what I would like to see. And I know that Uzoma and I are working on this together as they're the health critic. What do we need to see for the province to ensure, not only access to abortion, no matter where you live in the province, but all of the other things that come with that. And so I know like I said, for myself in the next year and a bit, we're developing this kind of overall provincial strategy that, hopefully if there's a change in government, that will be something that we'll pursue right away. I think it's really important.
Excellent. Anyone else want to speak to the question about next steps and priorities as we move forward from this difficult and I think important moment that we're all in? Kemlin.
Yeah, I think Nahani, definitely that is one thing that we definitely need, absolutely need. Some of the other things I think, first of all, one of the areas that we often forget about, and I touched on a little bit in what I was saying, is this lack of training, a lack of providers, right? Because that is actually a real barrier. We can't provide abortions if we don't have people who are trained in providing both medication and surgical abortions. And that is actually something, if there's a way for people to work with the College of Physicians and Surgeons here in Manitoba, as well as across the country, in terms of making these part of the training that is provided to doctors, so that people are getting it right up front, right? And so, as well as working with the universities that provide medical programs, those are things that are an absolute, because even as one of the major providers in this province, every time we go to try and hire somebody, like, it is very, very difficult because there are so few providers. And the fact is that you cannot get trained in Manitoba if you do not have a job offer at an abortion provider to provide abortions. So basically what it means is, specifically around surgical abortions, if you do not have a job offer, so a written job offer, you cannot get into the program to be able to actually take that training. That in itself is totally limiting. So to be able to hire people, there is a very limited scope of people.
Thank you. Karen.
I agree with all of the suggestions. I'd add a couple of additional, I think at the grassroots level, like, we need to have really sustained and organized campaigns.
And so we provide between 1,600 to, we provide between 2,000 to 2,200 per year. So ultimately, we need more funding to provide to meet the needs. And the other thing is, it needs to be not just centered in Winnipeg. The government should be providing funding to other agencies outside of Winnipeg, right? There are some abortion providers outside of Winnipeg, and those need to also be supported, right? You know, here at the Women's Health Clinic, we don't want to be the, you know, the sort of controllers of that. I think that there needs to be clinics in the north that provide abortion care, both surgical and medication abortion. There needs to be clinics in the south, in every region in the province, right? And so those would be kind of the main things that I would say we need to start working on right away.
Thank you for that. Absolutely. And I'll just pass things over now to Karen Sharma, who'll pick that question.
Sorry about that, Kemlin, if I cut you off. I think there was a little glitch on my end and things froze up, but I completely agree that we are underfunded for providing both surgical and medical abortion care. We need to expand access across all regions, and we need people to be trained in providing abortion care access. I think we also at the grassroots level need to be to have some sustained organizing to put that political pressure on all levels of government around this issue to ensure that we're realizing these rights. And we also need to be realistic about the gaps in access within our region and have better mutual aid and care supports available to people here as well. I think one thing I've learned just in connecting, across borders around how activists are mobilizing in the States is that we have a lot to learn around abortion support funds and things that we can be doing to ensure that people that are in the north, that are in remote regions of Manitoba have access to support. And so we should be, I'd love to see in the next year us establishing an abortion support fund within our province that gives people the monetary support they need to be able to access care if they need to come into Winnipeg for either a medical or surgical abortion. And of course, we need to ensure that there are continued legal protections for abortion providers and pay attention to the ways that, Kemlin, you noted that there's, an increased rhetoric and I think an emboldening of anti-choice organizers, and we have to be really careful about that and the ways that it might increase stigmatization for those that are needing access to abortion in the next little while. So maybe ramping up mental health supports and other kinds of care for folks that need access to these healthcare services in the coming years, because I think that that we might see, just a real retrenchment of a desire to seek abortion care when needed.
Absolutely. I'm just wondering if anybody else from the panel has any final things that you want to add, perhaps to that question, which leaves us with a lot to chew on. Okay. Yeah, Sarah, absolutely.
I'm really struck by, I remember Karen talking about the idea of a shower, or this sort of discussion, open discussion of abortion, I think is another way to be active. The narrative about abortion and changing the idea that this is shameful, that this is something that people have to keep from their families, or women shouldn't talk about, or people shouldn't talk about with their friends. And I do see that changing a bit. I think that between social media and sort of stories in the media, there is, and I can even think in my own family, like people discussing issues that never would have talked about this, 10 or 20 years ago. And so I think there is an opportunity right now, because I think that many Canadians are very shocked to see what happened in the United States. And I think that being open about this, that maybe if we can change the narrative about abortion and also really emphasize this as a human right, as part of healthcare, that this is, these are medical decisions, that this could also shift some of the stigma and hopefully counter some of the really hateful rhetoric that we see from anti-choice forces.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I want to just very quickly thank Cassie Dong, who has joined us with some needed tech support and knowledge on this event. Thank everybody, and turn things over to Shayna Plout to offer just a quick final thank you as we close out the hour.
Thank you, very, very much. And Sarah, I really appreciate you bringing us back to the reality that the personal, the very personal, the body, the personal is political, and then the political is also personal. I know I come from this from a very, very personal place, and it's very easy to then feel isolated and feel alone in that situation. And one of the things that I think everybody here has been speaking about is the fact that we turn to our social fabric for strength. Right? That the personal is political and the political is personal, but that does not mean the individual, right? So we turn to each other for strength, and we turn to each other, whether it's in a means of analysis, whether it's actually a means of accessing healthcare itself, whether it's a means of advocacy, whether it's a means of putting bills in front of the legislature. And I want to end actually in that way of coming from this from outrage, but ending with hope and ending with looking at the strength that we have when we can collectively speak not just to the violations of healthcare and human rights, but also to the ways of being able to reframe and go forward in a powerful way. And I want to thank Adele and the Center for Human Rights Research actually for being able to use this platform actually as one way of being able to contribute this to this. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Nahani, Karen, Lindsay, Kemlin, Sarah, for just being able to share what you know and how you know it, and provide some ways that we can go forward.
Yeah, so thank you very much. Just ditto all of that. Let you know there will be more to come. So, this is a beginning, not an end. It's a constant struggle, and it is a constant question. We've had some resources shared in the chat from the Women's Health Collective, in particular, template for writing your politicians. We will post that on the socials of the Center for Human Rights Research. And you can sign up for our email list if you're interested, going to our website, and keep in touch. We're looking forward to sharing more space as we continue to kind of raise these questions and share what we know and what we can do to make change. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. The recording will be available too.
Thank you, everyone.
You're muted, Adele.
I will just end the session for the people who have stayed on the line.
Yep.